In this video, I'm going to describe the use of visual controls provided in Flex that allow you to navigate and select files and directories from the local file system. These visual controls were described briefly in the first video in this chapter. They're based on the existing list-based controls that are a part of the Flex framework: the list, the combo box, the data grid, and so on. To demonstrate these controls, I'm going to use an application named visualcontrols.mxml that's a part of the Chapter 4 project. If you're following along in the exercises, open the application in FlexBuilder now. I'll expand the source code to full screen. You'll see that this is a very simple application that just has an HBox container, a label, and a text control. To allow a user to navigate and select files and directories, use one of these controls. I'll start with the simplest of them, the file system list control. I'll declare the file system list control using an mxml tag. I'll give it an ID of fslist. And then I'll set its initial directory. The directory property points to a file object that refers to an actual directory. In this example, I'll use a binding expression that points to the static property file.application directory. Then I'll create a button control. I'll give it a label of show selected, and then a click event listener. Within the click event listener, I'll call a method called clickhandler. I'll close the button tag. Then I'll create a script section and create the function clickhandler. The clickhandler function will receive an event object typed as a mouse event and return void. And within the function, I'll go and get the selected value from the file system list control, and I'll display the selected file's native path in the text control with an ID of selected text. I'll start with the code selectedText.text equals, and then I'll get the selected file object, fslist.selectedItem.nativePath. In the clickhandler method call, I'll pass in the event object, and then I'll test the application. Notice that as the application starts up, it points to the directory or folder that contains the application executable. The contents of the list control will differ depending on whether you're running in FlexBuilder in debug mode or you run the same application after packaging and installing it. In this case, we're pointing to the bin debug output folder that's part of the FlexBuilder project. Notice that I can click on any item and then click the Show Selected button, and I'll see the native path of the selected folder or file. I'll double-click into the Assets folder, and that'll take me into its contents. I'll select one of the files, largecontacts.xml, click the Show Selected button, and now I see the full native path of that file. Let's try another one of the visual controls. This time I'll replace the file system list with the file system data grid. I'm also going to expand the width of the application as follows. I'll set the width to 600 pixels and the height to 500. I'll save the changes and run the application. And you'll see that the reason I set the windowed application to a little bit larger width is because the data grid control is going to take up quite a bit more horizontal space. Once again, I can double-click down into the Assets folder. I can press the backspace key to return, and I can pick an item out of the data grid and click the Show Selected button, and I'll see the item's native path displayed. Notice that if I go into an area and I click the Show Selected button without first having selected something, I'll get a runtime error indicating that I'm trying to refer to an object that's null. That's because the current code assumes that I've selected something from the data grid. To prevent that behavior, I'll add an enabled property to the button control, and I'll set the value of the property using a binding expression that looks like this: fslist.selectedIndex not equal to -1. As with the corollary visual controls in the Flex framework, if the user has not selected an item from the data grid, the list, or other visual control, the selected index property returns a value of -1. So this expression, if the user hasn't selected something, will return false, and the button will not be enabled, and the user won't be able to click it. I'll save and test the application again. And you'll see that as the application opens up, once again, it's showing the contents of the initial folder, the application folder, but because I haven't selected anything from the data grid, I can't click the button. When I click on an item, the button becomes enabled and I can click it. If I double click into a folder, you'll see that nothing is selected and therefore once again the button is disabled. I'll select an item and click the button, and once again you can see the contents. There are two other visual controls worth looking at. The next one is the File System Combo Box. The File System Combo Box is a pull-down list. As with the list control, it shows a list of all the items in the current directory. It shows the current directory name of bin-debug, and then it shows a tree-style control that lets you drill upward. But the combo box doesn't allow you automatically to move downward through the tree. If you want that sort of functionality, instead use a file system tree. I'll replace the existing file system combo box with the file system tree, and once again run the application. This time, you'll see that I can navigate upward and downward through the file tree. Once again, I can select a file, click the Show Selected button, and see its native path. But because I'm starting off at a root folder, I have access to everything from that root folder on down. Unlike the list control, pressing the backspace button in this control doesn't take me upward. If I wanted to navigate upward from this root folder up to its parent directory, I'd have to do that programmatically. But because I'm in a tree control, once I've started at one directory, I have access to everything under that directory automatically. There's one other visual control worth knowing about. It's called the File System History button. The File System History button works like this. I'm going to put a file system list back in this time, and then right under that I'll add an HBox control. And within the HBox control, I'm going to create two instances of the class File System History button. The first one is going to be used to navigate backward through the history of selections in the file system list. I'll set its data provider as follows. I'll use a binding expression of fslist.backhistory. I'll add an item click event listener. When the user clicks on any item in the history button, I'll call this function fslist.navigateback, and I'll pass in a value of event.index. This means go back the number of times based on which item in the list I selected. Now let's take a look at the result. I'll run the application. I'll double-click down into the Assets folder and then pull down the list of available history. And you'll see that bin-debug is in the history list. I'll click to select it, and that moves me back to that step. Now I'll close the application, and I'm going to copy and paste the File System History button, so I have two of them within the HBox control. For the second one, I'll change the data provider from fslist.backhistory to fslist.forwardhistory. And I'll change the item click event listener so that instead of calling the navigate back function, it calls the navigate forward function. Once again, I pass in event.index. I'll run the application. I'll double-click down into the Assets folder. Take a look at the back button, and you'll see bin-debug is listed there. I'll go back there. Now look at the forward button, and you'll see that the Assets folder is listed there. So the File System History button is most useful with the file system list and the file system data grid, neither of which controls have the ability to navigate forward and backward on their own. The History button is less useful with the tree control, because the tree control already offers you the ability to see all parts of the root folder's subfolder structure. If you use the History button control, you typically use two, one to go back in the history and one to go forward. So that's a look at all the different visual controls in Flex and Air that give you direct access to navigating and selecting files and directories from the local file system.